So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this I think is the first lore-friendly siege we've had in a little while, and it's on a newly created map by Tommy as well. And we see Gondor, Rohan, and I believe it's Lothlorien as well over in the distance over there. Indeed it is. So that will inform where we are geographically, probably somewhere either in eastern Rohan or perhaps in the northern part of Gondor there in the gap by the White Mountains' edge. Interesting looking settlement as well. Obviously it's pretty standard fare as far as the cityscape goes, but there are also bridges as part of its main construction, which will be a real boon actually for the defenders, because if the attackers are forced to take bridges like that, they're narrow choke points, and choke points, elevation, sight lines, all of these things very, very important for defenders' chances in 3v5s, as we've seen in the most recent two. They've given it a bloody good go, the defenders, but they haven't been able to quite get the job done. So quite what to call this settlement as well. I'll have to check, I suppose, if there is an intended name for it. If not, I'll have to try and pick one out from the very small print, I suppose, in some of the lore. Now then, moving on to the attackers, we shall start off with Tweak Dunland. It wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that they would be an adversary of the defending factions here today. Big numbers as well, always a real plus for any attacking faction. I mean, just in general, Dunland are one of the exclusively numbers-focused factions, really, that the game has to offer, alongside the likes of the Misty Mountains, also Angmar to a certain extent. But we have the Ravenborn Wardens here, one of the units of genuine quality that they do have. Very good mix of crossbows and heavier spears, at least by the standards of the faction. And then also the mounted variant of them as well, which are ideal cavalry killers, really, because they can first do good damage at kiting enemy heavy cavalry around with those bolts, and then they're also pretty damn adept at facing them down in melee as well with their war clubs. Hidden units here, which could very well be the Beastmen of Dunland, a very aggressive attacking force. A little bit concerned by the dropping frames when you look towards the centre of the map. That's a sign that there's a structure causing issues, but we'll see if that proves to be an issue. Dunnish Warband also played their part in the very last siege for Old Merlond that we saw. These slings capable of doing some pretty savage damage, especially considering how many of them there are. It's a very similar sort of thing with cheaper javelins, where there's no ideal way other than really demolishing them with cavalry charges for the defenders to deal with them. They're always going to be efficient in some way other than in that instance, and of course Dunland, as we just mentioned with those Ravenborn, are very capable of defending themselves from cavalry, as you would expect given their adversaries being Rohan. The standard Ravenborn as well, heavy axeman, very heavy axeman, and dealing hefty armor piercing damage as well. More useful against the central Gondorian defending army here than the two on the flank, but still, just the base damage of this kind of unit as well is going to be very, very useful. A couple of units of Dunlending clansmen as well, equipped with the helms and what little armour that they can be. Very numerous, obviously spears as well, but it's exactly what you'd expect from an evil men militia unit, really. They're not going to win any prizes for quality, but numbers, that's certainly in their favour. Large amounts of standard pikes as well. The Dunlending pikemen, again, cheap and cheerful as far as pikemen go, but this is one of those unit classes that can really punch above their weight in terms of the money invested into them, purely because of the way that pikes work. Obviously, though, missiles are going to be a real problem, and to an extent all of the defending factions, but especially the elves, of course, are capable of ripping through units like this. And some Dunnish huntsmen here on the flanks. Not a huge amount of really long-range units, at least from what we can see from Dunland. But that's not too surprising. They're not really built for skirmishing, even against Rohan have got some options in that regard as well, but they would be best off leaving that to other factions. I mean, Isengard, more known for their close-range punch perhaps, certainly a more professionally structured army than their Dunland underlings. Nazkai, very much in the same vein as the Ravenborn, only an even more extreme example of very heavy, very elite shock infantry with armour piercing. Very dangerous to the Gondorians, of course, though Rohan and certainly Lothlorien have got answers to deal with such units. The Trolls of the White Hand, we've seen how effective this type of unit can be in this new version of the game, and if they are going to force their way through the winding initial sections of this settlement, the Trolls could be ideal for that. Guards of Orthanc as well, very heavy, very defensively adept. I mean, of all of the evil orc factions, well, that's a bit of a misnomer really, but yeah, all of the orc factions, the Guards of Orthanc really typify the fact that Isengard are the most defensively well-rounded, you would suggest. They mix offense and defense together really nicely. Angmar, of course, have got very hefty defensive values, but it's with a certain aggressive edge, whereas Isengard have a bit more of a well-rounded look to them, perhaps more akin to the Western Kingdoms of Men they find themselves within geographically. Isengard Ballista, if they can find good sightlines on this map, it could be devastating, but it's an awkward kind of settlement for siege weaponry like this, unless you get that really good position, especially for a ballista with its more linear fire. Standard Uruk-hai infantry, very, very effective at what they do, of course, very well rounded, like I just said. Good armour, good shields, good attacking values for this kind of unit as well. They're pretty expensive though, for what they are, obviously, especially in comparison to many other standard Orcish infantry. So you do need to be wary of that. If you do want to save a bit of money, the Uruk-hai Raiders are the way to go. Far more numerous, but also far less equipped than their heavier brethren. And then we've also got Uruk-hai Reavers over here again, a little bit of an armour-piercing edge to them. All of Isengard, they've got plenty of shock infantry, all of which being armour-piercing Isengard, which means they're good against pretty heavily armoured factions and dealing damage against them, but maybe less well suited for dealing with someone like the Elves. Uruk-hai Pikemen, in comparison to the Dunlanders, of course, better trained, better equipped. Still a lack of a shield though, so arrows do present a problem, and only one unit of crossbows from what we can see. I mean, if they can get into a good position, that may be all they need, however. Now then, moving on to this central army, another Isengard force from the Womb Raider. Guards of Orthanc right in front, so things are going to get underway pretty quickly from the start here, you would imagine. Uruk-hai Raiders again, Uruk-hai Infantry, a couple of units of Uruk-hai Archers, so he does intend to at least humour Gondor in terms of skirmishing, though of course when it comes to long range abilities, Gondor certainly have the beating of Isengard. If Isengard want to be competitive in that regard, they'll need to close the distance quickly and hope for some good sightlines on the crossbows, in which case Gondor may be in for a long afternoon. We've got a big long line of Uruk-hai pikemen once again, Nazkai with the Trolls of the White Hand right next to them once more, and more Uruk-hai Reavers here as well. So similar, but perhaps a more distinct approach over here, a few more different types of units in Hidden's army there. The fourth of the 5 attacking armies over here, we have another Dunlander force, Tumihai over here, plenty of Dunish warband. Once again, we have some Dunlending clansmen, again some Dunlending pikemen, the Wardens both mounted and dismounted, with the general in the dismounted variant, and also the Ravenborn as well. So nothing different from what we can see here, but Dunland are one of those factions that do have quite a lot of ambush units, so we may see a few things like the Beastmen is one thing I'm really expecting, because of their potential effectiveness against even the Elves, but especially against Rohan. I would imagine they should be pretty decent. And finally, last but not least, another Isengard army under Meven's command. So again, plenty of Uruk-hai infantry, maybe a bit more of an emphasis on them in this army, with some Uruk-hai Raiders as well. Certainly more emphasis on the Uruk-hai Reavers, which is an interesting one. Missile fire will be their bane, but we'll see. That damage could be enough to make it worthwhile. A couple of units of Uruk-hai crossbowmen, Guards of Orthanc, and some Trolls of the White Hand once again. So again, nothing too crazy from Isengard there, but they are a very by-the-books kind of faction in terms of their organisation. Now then, we have Tommy, who is playing as Rohan. Rohan probably the least naturally defensive in a siege of all of the defending factions today. They don't have any phalanx units, and just in general they're a little bit less rigid than many of their Western counterparts, but what they lack in those terms they do make up for in terms of some pretty hefty, and especially in an armour-piercing way, damage. Medicel Guard, certainly one example of that. They are pretty good defensively as well, in melee you must say, being one of the more expensive units of javelins the game has to offer, but it is those javelins which are going to be the main event here. They're going to need to do some good damage with them. The Helm's Hammers, or Helm Hammers, just to give them their proper name, should be really good against the Isengard forces. That hefty armour-piercing damage, as well as their pretty strong defensive nature as well, means they should crack their way through most of Isengard's forces, and indeed against any Dunlander force that is of sufficiently or is not up to the task. Stuff like the Ravenborn might be good against them. We've seen the Westmarks be pretty useful in the most recent siege we saw Rohan defending in as well. Spearmen should make for a pretty damn good front line, and again they should counteract quite nicely actually the armour-piercing focuses of Meven's army in Isengard's sense here, purely because less of an armoured focus on Rohan, albeit they do sort of straddle the line really. They certainly have better armour than many of the other sort of Northmen-inspired factions that the game has to offer, but certainly not on the same level as the Númenórean Inheritor factions. Westmark infantry will be able to go toe-to-toe with Isengard a little bit more easily, and they should be pretty dominant against most of what Dunland have one-to-one in melee, but they will be worried about stuff like slings and maybe beastmen getting in and around them. Huge amount of armour-piercing shock infantry as well, similar story to Isengard on the attack, then only this time on the defence. Again, those big, hefty attack values and armor piercing values. I think just in terms of looks and concept of a unit, the Westmark Marshals have always been my favourite for Rohan, and Tommy has gone heavy in for them here. Though in terms of sheer effectiveness, as we've seen time and time again, it is the Shield Maidens that actually prop Rohan up defensively. Throwing axes, very, very potent, of course. The Shield Maidens in general are pretty well rounded, and with the encouragement auras now working, they should be better than ever, which will really give Rohan a nice edge on the defence. And then several units of Helmingas as well, the heaviest archer Rohan have. 4 of them. I think skirmishing for the defenders is going to be relatively straightforward. The attackers haven't brought a huge amount to counteract them, which means they should be able to use them as they desire, which will be an important factor for the defenders if they hope to be victorious. Winged Swordsmen, playing as the Gondorians, more naturally defensive of course, big armour values. The Fountain Guard also fantastic as a frontline force, even against the likes of Isengard. The very strong vanguard of King Elisar as well, if you compare them to the Nazkai on the other side of the field. More finesse about them, more base attack as a standard heavy swordsman, but they do lack that armour piercing. But it's give and take on this battle. It's not as if armour piercing is universally useful or useless against the opposing team, both for attackers and defenders today. Gondor Spearmen and Gondor Infantry with the armour upgrades and without. Interestingly, he's decided to go with the Spearmen as the upgraded ones this time around, seeing as the infantry are more numerous, but we'll see. Maybe it's just for uniformity. It's still a very efficient frontline combatant as long as they're supported properly against a force like Isengard's. Veterans of Osgiliath with full armour upgrades are one of the best units of heavy archers the game has to offer. Trading back and forth with enemy archers is going to be easy for them, especially standard Uruk-hai. Locked morale is also a potentially very useful thing if it comes down to a nail-biting conclusion. Standard Gondor archers, again, will be just fine in this situation. As we just said with Rohan, certainly with Gondor, they should be pretty comfortable trading what arrow fire there is, though they will want to be a little bit careful of Womb Raider's slightly higher amount of Uruk-hai crossbows. Has to be said, in recent siege battles, the artillery has not really pulled its weight, though in this kind of situation, surely now is the moment that the trebuchet will come good. And indeed it can, but it hasn't been the match winner the defenders needed it to be in the last 2 games. And then Citadel Guard with their javelins, more Fountain Guard as well. And there's some Guards of Osgiliath in there. So a strong force indeed. Bringing the quality and certainly bringing some good ranged punch, you would imagine, however, are going to be the Elves of Lothlorien under T.S. Niehoff's command. Staff Masters are in and amongst the heavier Galathrim units, Galathrim Warriors, Galathrim Archers and Galathrim Axemen. Karen Amroth Rangers in there as well, but that central Galathrim force, I mean, especially considering now those Galathrim Axemen have throwing axes as well as being very effective line infantry units in their own right as well, should be looking at a pretty effective defensive force, albeit a limited one in terms of numbers. The ultimate clash of styles really when it comes to a force like Lothlorien against a force like Dunland. Then we also have the Kindred of Celeborn in there, again very similar thing, very effective in melee but also throwing axes. Galathrim Nobles with Silverthorns. I mean, Silverthorns, it's not so much a gimmick of a unit, 'cause it can be useful, it's just useful in kind of a hidden way throughout the battle. But obviously the damage and then their effectiveness in melee is going to be one of the main things to watch out for here. More Galathrim Archers and a huge amount of ranged power from the defenders here today. That's where they're going to win or lose this battle, you would suggest. And in a settlement like this, I think that's understandable considering the kind of sight lines and the kind of positions they can dig into. They don't need huge reserves of infantry, just a few well-placed defensive points, and then huge amounts of damage could be enough. Galathrim Riders gives them a little bit of mobility on the field, which of course Rohan have none of their cavalry today, interestingly enough. They do need to be careful of those mounted Ravenborn though. They do outrange them, but as soon as the Ravenborn get into range, the punch that those crossbows offer could render the Galathrim Riders an expensive waste of money pretty quickly. So micro-intensive, but they could get the most out of them because vice versa could also happen. The range could be key. I'll make a little bit of a cut. I don't know how much or how long that's going to be, considering how close the attacking armies are, but they may wait a good while for Rohan and Lothlorien to get themselves situated before they actually start moving in. So I will rejoin when the battle is about to get underway. So we may as well rejoin here because the battle is most certainly imminent, with these half-orc spear guards starting to move forward, a little bit of cover from the Dunnish huntsmen as well. They've got a few options, certainly on this side of the settlement as well, the attackers, of how they want to do things. The more direct route to the summit of the settlement means that they don't have to go through the bridges, but those hills over there are very, very punishing, especially considering it's Lothlorien they're going to be defending. those narrow choke points, so the ranged and melee threat that they offer might be a little bit too much. Alternatively, they can punch right on through here and try and join up with the forces of the Uruk-hai marching through from the front, which might be the cleverer thing to do, but Gondor does have a little bit of elven support here at the front as well, so pretty well rounded. They then of course have to contend with the bridges. It's a very similar story over on this side as well, with Rohan guarding a direct route to the town centre, but again extremely difficult to fight your way through such a narrow choke point. Rohan may offer less of a threat at long range than Lothlorien do, but still capable of dishing out some pretty hefty punishment in other ways in which Isengard are weaker to as well. A bit labyrinthine, this settlement, so it is certainly going to be interesting how the attackers deign to set the stall out. As long as they move in an organised manner, it can make life significantly more difficult for the defenders. Again, Lothlorien over here. I was expecting the first blows to be struck to be pretty imminent. I mean, it's probably going to be over here by the looks of things, and indeed it is. Small conflict has already taken place with the Dunland clansmen forming Shiltron formation, the elves now getting into melee. I mean, it will be a simple matter, even with this more defensive formation, for the Dunlanders to be overrun by the elves, but the main threat to the elves' immediate safety is going to come in the shape of these slingers. We saw them be very important last time around, and point blank like this, they are going to be a dangerous foe, but getting interrupted as they are here isn't ideal for them. Staff Masters, I mean, Danish Warband are capable of defending themselves in melee, but it's certainly not their primary function against the elves as well. That quality discrepancy is simply going to be too high, but they're getting really good blows off here. TS Niehoff needs to do something about this. 3v5, of course, the margin for error is so small that you simply cannot afford to take these kind of losses. If they can get these Dunland clansmen out of the way, that will help matters significantly. Meanwhile, the arcing shots there of the ballista now moving in as well, and managing to get some really nice hits down the flank of these Gondorian skirmishers. I mean, conventional wisdom might say that pulling back early might be the thing to do if the settlement itself is not doing you any favours when it comes to giving you cover from attacking artillery. Again, this is on paper this is a pretty good defensive position, but that Isengard ballista has effectively rendered it inert. If the Gondorians do take up a position here, they're simply going to take far too much damage at the hands of that ballista, and they're continuing to do so. Classic medieval 2 artillery, where it just spins on the spot instead of moving in a concise manner. More of the Gondorians waiting, but so far still the prelude to any sort of large-scale engagement. Similar story over here as well. Rohan not yet being pressured, although some of the half-orc spear guard moving across the bridge, taking a bit of damage. Some of the Rohirrim are here. I mean, the elven, very elite Karas Galadon's Guardians are here as well, which, I mean, if there is a unit that's going to be perfect for dealing with them, it will be the Trolls of the White Hand. And so far, the attackers have been intent on utilising their skirmishers to good effect. Tommy does notice the fact that these Uruk-hai are cranking their crossbows, however. Or does he? I mean, this isn't going to be doing anyone any favours. They need to just get into melee, and that is what they are now doing. The Trolls close by, though, should be pretty good at facing down the Westmark spearmen. Continuing to push forward. I mean, this is all well and good, but they won't do particularly well against the Trolls. Fountain Guard may do a little bit better with their offensive prowess. Athelian Rangers starting to fire, ripping through the Uruk-hai archers, which is all well and good, but do you really want to be skirmishing with them? Again, in a 5v3 like this, you have to be very critical, really, of what the defenders are actually doing. And so far, maybe some missteps, minor as they may be, they do have a tendency to really add up. Over here, meanwhile, Uruk-hai raiders being tasked with trying to take on the Galadhrim warriors. I mean, the armour piercing isn't actually going to be at its most useful against the leather-clad Uruk-hai in comparison to the ones wearing plate, but even so, I mean, the discrepancy in quality here is going to be so high that the Lothlorien warriors should hew their way through these raiders with relative impunity. Meanwhile, let's go and see what's happening over here. The initial engagement. I mean, in terms of sheer numbers, more of the Dunlanders have fallen, but most of them are completely unimportant as regards to quality. I mean, they have now also brought forward some Dunlanding pikemen to try and dictate the pace of the engagement with the elves. But some of their number, not too sure, thinking they could rout. Starting to stabilise a little bit more now. In the elves, I'm a little bit surprised actually that the elves are not utilising more of the, I mean, they are now starting Karen Amroth Rangers firing away. Units in behind. I mean, the Ravenborn make for a very tempting target just because of their damage potential. A lot of units here in reserve as well, which have some cover from the buildings, but many a projectile still hitting their marks. At the very least, though, from an elven perspective, the Dunlanders are no longer able to get their slingers into as advantageous a position as they were not too long ago. I mean, the combination now of the pikes and the hefty damage coming in from the Ravenborn means that Lothlorien are probably going to start to get driven back slowly but surely. Meanwhile, the Rohirrim backs to the wall over here. Westmark Spearmen, infantry and marshals. I mean, it does mean, of course, there can be no retreat from this location, but it's a fairly hefty defensive force, and they do have the support from on high from those projectiles. I mean, stuff like the Uruk-hai Reavers will be especially vulnerable to that sort of thing. Not able to lay down their full capabilities either. So far, though, Rohan definitely being quite restrained with the use of their own projectiles, which is good. Means that they're thinking ahead. Then over here from the front, I mean, there's a lot of scattered dead for Isengard at the moment, and a large amount of that is going to be down to the Gondorian skirmishers that are all about them. Continuing to take damage here and there. Veterans firing away at the Uruk-hai archers, which again, all well and good, but this is exactly the sort of task that the Womb Raider would have had in mind for his archers in the first place. Meanwhile, throwing axes being lobbed over the heads of these Lothlorien warriors, just a little bit of extra help. I mean, the armour piercing will certainly be more useful against the half-orcs that have now joined the front line with their ramshackle armour. Yeah, Lothlorien axemen, I mean, having to bank their shots fairly high, but most of them still hitting their intended targets, and every little bit of damage will help. Each one that hits is very likely to result in a kill as well. And they're out of ammunition as well, of course. It means that they can also join the melee fight, which is probably why the Lothlorien warriors were committed so early. They want to be utilising all of their throwing axes from these units first and foremost, try and get as much of those kills as they possibly can. I don't think they have a huge amount of ammunition though, the Lothlorien axemen. They're supposed to be very much this multifaceted kind of unit. So far the elves comfortable, although the presence of trolls is going to change that no matter what. There's a lot of throwing axes that just hit the trolls. None of them dead yet, but that is going to result in an awful lot of damage done to them. Not wanting to take any chances whatsoever, many of them bloodied up now. Any sort of engagement with the elves is also the most dangerous foe that the trolls could face on the field, so hoping that they could just loiter around in behind the line and be committed as and when is not going to be the case now, albeit banking those shots from that ballista, which so far has been a real menace for the defenders to have to contend with. Still fighting to the death. I mean, if we... plenty of support still. No great commitment of resources over here just yet. Snaga skirmishers moving forward but wavering. There was this flanking force over here, the Westmark Spearmen continuing. It seems more like one of those games of cat and mouse where the Mevin is trying to bring his crossbows in. Every time he does, the spearmen come forward, so he retreats them. Then the spearmen have to retreat because the trolls are too great a foe for them to deal with in melee without support, and rinse and repeat really. Some of the spearmen are stuck in and amongst the Uruk-hai and half-orcs, which is bad for them obviously. The trolls being over here though does mean that that's one less unit of trolls for the main body of the Rohirrim army to have to try and deal with over here. Helmingas and again the Danish warband trying to stand and shoot, which is all well and good, but it does mean that they are going to be easier targets for the Westmark infantry in pure melee terms. And then again, when this backs to the wall defence, spear guard, reavers. Good combination of spears, swords and two-handed axes here from Rohan though. All of their better mainline units going to be able to hold down the fort, as it were. Again, it's a little bit of a weird frame rate in this map. Something is not quite right. Helmingas firing. Flaming shot is all well and good, but you're very unlikely to be routing a significant amount of the Isengard forces at this early stage, so probably regular shot would be the call. Looks a little bit more striking though when you set your enemies ablaze. More of those Uruk-hai Reavers falling by the wayside. Consistent damage to pretty much all of these units that are stood here waiting around as well, so the Helmingas definitely contributing. They can also get involved in melee later on and not be completely overwhelmed by the task before them, so things looking okay for Rohan from that perspective. Westmark infantry of course superior to the Danish warband as we were mentioning, and doing a good job there. Over on the other side meanwhile, the elves have reinforced the line since last we saw, although Carin Amroth Rangers out of ammo, now being used in melee of course. That two-handed sword they have means they will be a little bit more dangerous to the Dunlanders in melee, but running out of ammo on a unit of Rangers is always a little bit of a sad moment for defenders, with that extra damage they're capable of. Dunlanding pikemen now on the way forward. I mean, the initial unit is still not doing too badly considering how long they've been in melee against elves at this point, but very important unit really for Dunland to be able to keep this engagement cost effective for them, keeping the elves at arm's length and not allowing them to lay down the huge amount of damage that they would otherwise be doing to the relatively lightly armoured Danish force. Still got decent amounts of reinforcements in behind him. In Half-Orc Axguard as a reinforcing unit. A few well-banked shots could be the sort of thing to start pushing the elves onto the defensive once more. Galathrym riders close by. Silverthorn arrows into the centre mass of this Dunland force would be pretty devastating. And just across the river, as we saw previously, maybe less progress being made over here. The elves, still with that initial unit of Galathrym warriors, comfortable on the front line. The backup of those throwing axes is certainly not hurt matters either against a force they were already superior to in terms of quality, so Isengard not able to get the ball rolling over here, but just keeping the engagement going and allowing other parts of the battlefield to get ahead of steam up might be the way to go, but that's a lot of death on the Isengard side of things. Danish huntsmen trying to get some... Do they have the angle of fire? Kind of. Again, Lothlorien no slouches when it comes to their own defensive abilities. Helmingas again showing good restraint considering the huge amount of Isengard forces just below them. Now, Guards of Orthanc moving forward, but a good response here, both the Westmark Marshals and the Helm Hammers. I mean, it's a huge amount of armour piercing. The Guards of Orthanc will struggle mightily to deal with this amount of attacking power coming their way. Victory seems certain for Rohan at the moment. Numbers here from Isengard and Dunland, and 59 Danish warband just routing from Hertumihai's force. So they're going to need to get more reinforcements on the front line of useful fighting men. Over here, I mean, this sort of cut-off force for Rohan. It's all a matter of whether or not they can be efficient or not. I mean, fire arrows over here may not be the worst idea. If Isengard do start to run out of steam, then morale shocks are definitely possible, and if Isengard and Dunland were to be routed beyond this point here, that would be a huge victory for Rohan. It shouldn't be the expectation, mind you. I mean, the Snaga having to bank their javelins, many of those are missing, but it's just their attempt to try and start doing more consistent damage to this Rohan front line, which admittedly is a little bit lopsided. Medicell Guard on the way down here now as well, javelins. Tommy's starting to dump more of his resources at this point, but the amount of damage he's doing is probably worthwhile. Meanwhile, at the front here, large-scale engagement happening now. Some of the Rohirrim over here giving the Gondorians a helping hand. Still good support coming in from the Gondorian skirmishers as well, but this is a far more robust attack from Isengard than anything that has been seen at the front end of the settlement since the battle began. And again, Gondor spearmen and Gondor infantry are all well and good, but when faced with the kind of damage that trolls can do, it's going to be difficult for them. Citadel Guard and Athelian Rangers. Oof. Grisly amount of damage being done to the Gondorian archers trying to offer their support. Again, that Isengard ballista proving to be one of the best tools that the attackers have had access to at this point in time. Again, more or less where the first engagements have taken place in the settlement are still where those front lines lay, so a little bit of territory was ceded to the attackers right from the start in certain points of the settlement, like here at the front, but once they've started resisting, so far the attackers have not been able to force them back from those defensive chokes that they've chosen. Again, my smart infantry, I mean, once again the Guards of Orthanc attempting to lead the way, but again being faced with strong armour-piercing opposition. That's tough for them. More arrows being banked over. Veterans of Osgiliath, perhaps out of ammunition, being committed to melee. Their locked morale nature will be useful on the front line. You know that they're going to fight to the bitter end. Pikes on the way forward as well. I mean, surely the Athelian Rangers and the like will be one of the likely choices of target there. Starting to really put the pressure on now in multiple locations across the battlefield. Hidden, moving forward with his trolls, committing forward a huge amount. Sindar Blade Masters being added to the front line. Dangerous, of course, and there's a huge amount of arrows being pumped into the Nazkai, none of them falling yet, but again, much like the trolls, it's the cumulative damage, getting rid of those hit points, and then you can see now they're starting to fall away pretty quickly. Heavily armoured though they may be. Oof. I mean, the ballista hitting the defenders, but also going right into their own units as well with a bit of friendly fire. It's a dangerous game that Hidden is now playing with his own army. Those Elven archers definitely capable of dishing out the damage quickly, as is the Elven infantry, of course. Nazkai added to the front line now as well. I think it may come down to how much ammunition these Galathrim archers have. Some Gondor archers, some Gondor infantry. Still potentially available as well to be added to the front line. A little bit of human support for this Elven-led endeavour. So far the front line's still very organised, and still most of it is very damaging Elven infantry as well, as is Lothlorien's wheelhouse, and even with more gusto applied, Isengard and Dunland not able to make that happen just yet. Similar story over here, though a narrower choke point and more of a slow grinding affair by design as a result of the pike focus that Dunland have put on this front line, but they will be hoping for some progress fairly soon, the attackers. They won't be panicking just yet. The amount of manpower they have in return or reserve is still enough where it's not too much of a concern. And limitless amount of reinforcements over here now, though, either. Some of Tweak's army, after all, heading down to try and punish them over there, and from way on high now as well, those Galathrim nobles going after these half-orc axe guard, ripping through them as well, and also making it difficult for them to shoot. This is a good example of the Silverthorn arrows doing their work. Not able to throw those axes while under the attention of those Galathrim nobles, and as a result that damage spike, which could be sorely needed, really, is now not forthcoming. The Gondor infantry now getting committed, trying to try and really drive home the defensive advantage over here, I suppose. The trolls starting to fall away. I mean, the elves starting to get in and amongst the line now as well, which is a problem. Isengard are effectively surrounded. That pike block in the middle is the centre of their efforts, but with Gondorian numbers now being added to the equation, I don't think Isengard are going to be in too good a shape. Are they starting to make any inroads elsewhere on the battlefield? Not really over here. It's a similar story. This time around, however, it's Gondor with a little bit of Rohirrim support. There goes Hidden's general. Starting to lose generals is a bad sign as well. Meanwhile, over here, the trolls. I mean, the Fountain Guard are going to be a far more dangerous opponent for the trolls, and so far, they haven't been the tour de force that they have been in some other battles here. Trolls of the White Hand are some of the stronger trolls that the game has to offer as well. Over here, meanwhile, this is actually where the attackers are gaining more ground, perhaps. Rohan. It does seem as though Mavin decided to refocus his Isengard army and help push with her Tumahai against Rohan. I mean, Rohan are perhaps the least defensively inclined faction, so a little bit of ground being made. I mean, Medicel Guard have been run through. Some Westmark Marshals, which are fighting backs against the wall style. But there are some Gondorians here as well. Medicel Guard still alive. Helmingas, are they going to be used as a rear guard? Holding back the Uruk-hai infantry. I mean, we did mention that Helmingas can double as decent line infantry, but against dedicated line infantry, the discrepancy will be too great. They will need help. And as if on cue, the Fountain Guard do join the fray, and they will be a real problem for Isengard, certainly for the Uruk-hai infantry. I mean, snugger skirmishers here purely for numbers, just trying to keep that momentum going, which the attackers do have a little bit of over here. Pikes now getting onto the front line. One of the more impressive units that the attackers have had in a more functional sense has been the Dunlanding pikemen. Been able to get those units into good positions. Medicel Guard are there, Shield Maidens in intimidating positions, to be sure. I mean, they have forced their way through, so I mean there are pockets of Rohirrim resistance still in behind the enemy lines, and they're still fighting hard, inflicting casualties. Certainly the most chaotic fight is this one over here, which tends to favour the attackers, of course. Flaming shots, banking over there, but I mean, Beastmen are a worthy opponent to go after, I suppose, a worthy target. Just because it is, I mean, they are lightly armoured and they are damaging. So dealing with them from afar before they can lay down that effectiveness is perhaps the way to go. But when they're lodged in a choke point against Karas Galadon's Guardians, I don't think they're going to be the answer anyway. But maybe I'm wrong. They're trying to force their way through sheer weight of numbers. But that's all well and good when it works, but how much can the attackers afford to do that at this stage? It is still a very even fight over here. Javelins and throwing axes being deployed all over the place. Again, Half-Orc Axe Guard, this time from her Tumahai. It is good to see that the attackers have mixed and matched their armies across multiple chokes and are not just simply taking sole responsibility for one and basically chopping the battlefield up into individual theatres. It does mean that you can mix and match your strengths. The defenders, of course, have done that as well, in a slightly more regimented fashion, however. Javelins. Shield Maidens in a nasty looking position as well. That's something the defenders have been doing up until this point. The trebuchets destroyed, the other trebuchet destroyed. I mean, that's a fairly damning indictment as well. We haven't really seen the trebuchet do anything. It's possible that it has, and we just weren't over here when it did, but it seemed to me like it was just dawdling around the place and ultimately ended up getting shot by the enemy ballista because it couldn't make up its mind what it wanted to do. That's a big amount of value lost as well. They may have gained a lot elsewhere, but of course 3v5s are cruel to the defenders. You need to be near perfect, and that is definitely not a perfect outcome for them. Speaking of which, good victory was won over here, but they can't afford now to have that victory lessened by damage being inflicted by these throwing axes and these crossbows. mounted and dismounted. Over on this side of the river, meanwhile, Galathrym riders moving in. Presence of cavalry, are they trying to inflict some morale shocks? I mean, heavy axemen and pikes are over here, so I really wouldn't recommend being that gung-ho with a unit that expensive, considering what we've already mentioned. Again, the Ravenborn are a dangerous unit, but against the Elves of Lorien, it's not an ideal matchup for them. And the Elves still should be able to hold on here without too many issues. Ravenborn Wardens will be hoping to do some damage. Kindred of Celeborn on the way down here as well. Still the Galathrym Nobles, fresh from their escapades earlier on. Still some Helmengas up here. Shield Maidens, over here. They have managed to completely clear out most of these areas. There's still these spears, who, amusingly enough, victory still seems certain for them. Goes to show the shortcomings of the Dunnish warband when it comes to their melee abilities, I suspect. Over here, still trying to use those javelins, but again, the angle of fire is not ideal. They'll be getting just as much friendly fire as hits on the opposition, and they're more likely to kill their own men given the lower defensive nature, even of Isengard, when you compare them to something like the Fountain Guard. Gondor's best, the elites, and those Fountain Guard really doing a stand-up job for the moment. I don't know how much in the way of reserves the defenders really have over here, though, is the problem. So this may end up being a rearguard action of just trying to kill off as many of these attacking forces as you can, and then set up a more advantageous defensive position a little bit further back. I mean, most of the units are skirmishers. Helmengas and Shield Maidens of Rohan can perform in melee decently well enough. They definitely want to be using all their ammunition before they do that, though. Medicel Guard, of course, can as well, but they're all skirmishers that will be adopting their secondary stance at this point. Or at that point, I should say. They still have plenty of ammo for the time being, and Shield Maidens will be hoping to do a good amount of damage. The Bane Guard are on the way forward to try and offer a bit of extra punch against those Fountain Guard, but doubtless they will be one of the first choices of target that the Shield Maidens decide to go after. Good damage done. Towards the front. Having a look over here. Mounted Ravenborn Wardens now over here, so starting to pull back. I think it is now time, in all honesty, for the defenders to think about pulling back with a fair amount of their resources, because if they don't, they're going to end up, all of the good works that they did earlier on in this battle are going to come to naught. Galathrym Archers being used as the rearguard over here. Bandits and half-orc axe guard in melee won't be up to the task. Those trolls bloodied, but again, they have got the outcome they wanted to, the attackers over here. Took them a bit longer than they would have liked to, but the attackers have a decent amount still alive. Good amount of reinforcement. Stuff like the mounted Ravenborn Wardens will be more difficult to use in the further reach of the settlement. I mean, the retreat is going to be interesting here, because this is where the defenders perhaps will actually run into the issues of pathfinding across the bridge as well. But they're going to need to try and make it work, because the attackers are closing in. Did they leave it a bit too long to retreat? Veterans of Osgiliath pulling back. Galathrym Warriors. Guardians of Caras Galadon, still 17 of them. Trolls on the way as well. Yeah, having to manually path your units onto the bridge before they decide to use them is a massive pain. I wonder what in the code of Medieval 2 causes that to be the case. For the unit AI to want to use every route before using the bridge until they're actually on it. The mounted and dismounted Ravenborn Wardens are starting to become more and more of a central theme in this battle now. The punch of those crossbows, and also just the fact that they're one of the more resilient Dunlander units, means that they're going to be difficult to get rid of, but you need to be able to do so, because otherwise the damage they're going to be able to inflict over time is going to be too great for the defenders to bear. Kindred of Celeborn retreating as well. The Galathrim Riders can do a decent amount of damage with their Silverthorns and make it difficult for return fire from the crossbows as well, but they're making do for now. Still the elves fighting well, but it's another area of the battlefield where the attackers are slowly turning things around, you would suggest. These beastmen of Dunland, which have played their part already. Again, the elves caught flat-footed, the Ravenborn Wardens lurching forward, spears in hand, try and pull down more of these elven riders. Again, another sign that they really need to be retreating with what they can, trying to probably defend the higher reaches of the hills. Ruffians now moving forward, immediately trying to make it so they can get across the bridge quickly, but veterans of Osgiliath will be there to stop them. Healthy amount of damage will be coming their way. Westmark Marshals ready to lend the Gondorians a hand. A little bit of a weird one there, clipping through the terrain, but that can happen with bridges at times. Shield Maidens are there ready to lend a hand as well, but wasting no time in trying to contest these bridges at this point. The attackers not wanting to let up now that they have managed to get the wind in their sails after taking some pretty hefty punishment earlier on. Get these mounted Ravenborn Wardens. Tweaks unit yet again, so his crossbows starting to have their impact. Isengard not wanting to be outdone, going to be moving their own crossbows forward. It's a huge amount of crossbows as well. It's 2 units of Ravenborn and 1 unit of the Uruk-hai, so plentiful bolts going to be sent towards the defenders here. Lothlorien, oh god, only 16 of them left. Involved in that big scrap the Gondorians were in earlier on. Not many of them remain. They're going to be committed over here. I mean, with less crossbows over here, this is more of just a straight up brawl, and the Gondorians will probably prefer that, honestly. Are the attackers continuing to make inroads over here, or has their progress been stymied? Looking like it could be the latter. Shield Maidens getting involved in melee as well. Swords drawn after their axes have been thrown. The Fountain Guard still being the centrepiece of this defensive effort, of course. Helmingas, 93. Still these Snaga skirmishers launching their javelins high. Any extra bit of damage, though, of course, as we've already seen with the ballista hitting their own man, the attackers will be far more okay with a bit of friendly fire here and there than the defenders will be. Still a small matter of ranged support, though, for Rohan. I think Tommy, I mean, over here might be the place where they do just put all of their eggs into this basket. No need to retreat, really. They don't have that much that they can retreat with at this point. And then the bridges. Sindar Blade Masters moving forward, trying to pressurise all of those units of crossbows in melee. I mean, the elves, do they have the manpower? That's always the question with the elves. Their quality is never in question, but whether they can sustain it over a long period of time once casualties have been taken. More trolls, who have been a presence in this battle, but actually I think one thing the defenders have done pretty well is limit the effectiveness of how brutal trolls can be. Throwing axes now also being used to try and deal with the Uruk-hai and the Ravenborn just in behind before their crossbows can fully be utilised, although the Dunlanders will be hoping that they can use their slings if that does prove to be the case anyway. Will the elves be sending anything else? Shield Maidens continuing to do their thing. Ever the central pillar of any Rohan defence. Galathrim Riders have moved over here now. Gondor continuing to force the enemy back. I mean, the quality of the units they've got in melee over here is not great from the attackers. Ruffians are not going to be able to deal with fully upgraded veterans of Osgiliath or Fountain Guard. Even Gondor archers that are out of ammunition are probably their superior in melee, so... And then with all those Silverthorn arrows as well, going after the Ravenborn Wardens. Scattered skirmishers from the attackers trying to do what damage they can to this Gondorian counter-offensive, but for now... Crossbows have found themselves a little nook over here, actually, managing to go through the building. More of a map oversight that than anything, though, I think. The fact that, well, this isn't. That's fair game, I suppose. Good position for the crossbows to be in, though, as they continue to do damage to the Gondorians. Westmark Marshals returning down here, having retreated a little bit. Again, those elves are... There goes another general. I think that's a little bit further, but those elves having to hold back trolls and all sorts, those Westmark Marshals need to scurry their way over to reinforce that line quickly. Otherwise there's going to be a huge gaping hole in the defenders' defensive line. But yes, Tweak's general falls. Dunland general as well is going to be... The loss of a Dunland general is going to be keenly felt. I mean, both of the heavy hitters of the elves in melee, the Kindred of Celeborn and the Galathrim nobles, are over here. And as robust as the Ravenborn Wardens are in relation to the rest of their own faction, they're going up against some of the very best now. The announcer still doesn't fancy the chances of the defenders, and understandably so. Few too many engagements haven't really been efficient at all from them, and that often is the make or break. Tweak still has a decent number of these units still here. Karen Amroth Rangers, I mean, the quality of the elves is going to have to try and dig them out here, but it does also mean that all of this quality is not going to be able to be utilised elsewhere. Still a unit of Shield Maidens here at the top. The Trolls didn't quite make it in time, this unit of Westmark Marshals, to help the elves. Will these axes be enough to finally bring this unit of Trolls down? The Shield Maidens, if they're out of ammunition, will be joining in melee as well. The Rohirrim plugging the gap left by the elves. And the Gondorians have made their way completely to the other side of that bridge now. They have been taking hits from those ranged units the whole time, though, so whether they're going to start to falter and fade now, we'll have to wait and see. And the Galathrim Riders still doing their best to provide a bit of overwatch for the Gondorians, but Uruk-hai crossbows on their way in. It's probably one of the first times we've seen the Ravenborn get in a more isolated engagement with Gondorians. By far would be their preferred opponent with those big armour-piercing hits of theirs. Yeah, the Gondorians are going to fizzle out, unfortunately, I think, and slowly but surely we seem to be marching towards an attacker victory here. Simply too much left in the tank, I think. There's more projectiles come down from on high. Uruk-hai crossbows. Bayonets are going to be utilised. I mean, this Isengard ballista as well has been a menace. Not dealt with, really, by the defenders. Good use of it as well from Hidden, in spite of his own, the main body of his army actually struggling early on. But yeah, the difference between how both artillery pieces have been used here, pretty stark. And again, like I said, I think we'd have seen it if the Trebuchet had done anything of note. That engagement there was perfect for it, really, but it looked like it had already been destroyed by then. Big waste of money, big loss of potential for the defenders. They still have any ammunition, these Shield Maidens? A few more Elven stragglers joining with the Rohirrim on the front lines, and Galathrim Axemen. The Gondorian general, the first defensive general to fall. The Trolls, only 2 remain. The sooner they can fall, the less damage they do, the better. The Westmark Marshals, of course, as much as they can deal the damage the elves were doing, they may not be able to keep themselves alive to the same standard, so as the attackers continue to push through, I mean, pretty much what the attackers have is all that they're committing now, so this is a worrying sign as well, blasting through the defensive position that was over here. Another chaotic engagement as well, so they've chosen their moments well over on this side of the field, I think. Tommy's defensive setup has been decent, but at key moments maybe the reinforcements just weren't there to be able to help hold things together, and as a result they've managed to blast through point after point, leaving stragglers behind but being able to clear them up one by one. Helmengas fighting hard. The Medicel-Guard, I mean, they're a very tricky foe to bring down. Any units that have made it this far as well are just going to be mopped up pretty quickly by the Rohirrim defenders that are in behind over here, but will the Medicel-Guard's quality be enough? They do have backup as well in the form of the Shield Maidens. It's not a huge amount of quality over here either. I mean, decent amount of Uruk-hai infantry, which is solid, but they don't have the real heavy hitters, just consistent corpses as well. Shield Maidens pulling back, still the Galathrim Riders. This defensive position over here. I mean, the elves are going to win over here by the looks of things, so they will be able to commit some real high quality elsewhere. This may be the best hope the defenders have. Fight the attackers to a standstill everywhere else and then hope that the elven elites can see them over the line when the attackers have nothing left that can truly face them down. Kindred of Celeborn need to be killing off these Dunnish huntsmen as quickly as they possibly can, completely bypassing them by the looks of things. What's going on? Strange pathfinding. Yeah, they'll rout off pretty quickly. Two very high tier units, but mounted Ravenborn Wardens blasting through the front line. Still a troll alive. As soon as I said the trolls maybe hadn't been as impactful in this battle as they have been in others, one unit does seem to have distinguished itself. Ravenborn Wardens fighting evenly with the Galathrim Riders, but the numbers advantage is in favour of the attackers. So the Ravenborn probably going to be just fine there. I mean, without the troll directly on the front line, Dunnish Warband and Uruk-hai crossbows may start to struggle. Still, the fact that they have bolts and in reserve is surely a problem. Again, not a huge amount of outright quality. Karen Amroth Rangers breaking in the face of the Ravenborn. It's rare that the elves will do that, but it's a sign of what the situation really is for the defenders. Rohan able to form up more comprehensive defence over there. Still Dunland finishing off what remains of the units that were caught in behind their lines. Over here meanwhile, Medicel-Guard peeling themselves off the front line, which is only useful from Tommy's perspective if he's going to use those javelins immediately. If he isn't, then he may as well have left them on the front line so that they and the Shield Maidens could have been really dominant in melee. Trying to use as much of that ammunition as possible though. Able to do so as well. More of them falling. Some of them breaking as well. Definitely a worthwhile endeavour. Meanwhile, this is where compromised lines in other positions are going to be a problem, with Uruk-hai crossbows arriving from the captured positions on the bridges. They're now going to be forced into a melee engagement whether they like it or not, but of course the Uruk-hai crossbows will lose fairly handily to the Medicel-Guard, if nothing else. Shield Maidens again getting forced into melee. And they're retreating, but what's the point? If there's no units that you can use to block, which there is. Kindred of Celeborn have now arrived, as of the Galathrim nobles. Ravenborn Wardens still 12. Victory has been the attackers here on the front. The ballista, the crossbows. I mean, again, nothing of true note. I mean, I think those 79 Ravenborn Wardens are the thing that you would say will give the attackers a decent amount of comfort in their status. Kindred of Celeborn and Galathrim nobles. One unit of the Shield Maidens, if they have a little bit of ammunition, that could be a real difference maker. quality is definitely in favour of the defenders still. It's just a case of whether or not they can force it to be the kind of melee engagement that will allow them victory. If they get pinned by more crossbow bolts, charged by the admittedly depleted attacking cavalry, then it's not going to work out for them, but it is possible. This is a good example of that. The crossbows still setting up good firing positions. Going to try and finish off the Medicel Guard. Medicel Guard will kill off more of these Uruk-hai in the process. Shield Maidens, they were actually on the winning end of this engagement a moment ago, but that will surely have changed since more Uruk-hai infantry have fought their way to the front of this engagement, so it's just a case of again, trying to kill off as many as they can, give the Elven elites, with some of their sisters at the top there, the best hope of trying to eke out a victory. The announcer still doesn't feel particularly confident, does he? Perhaps understandably so, the numbers discrepancy is quite large. Still a little bit of quality as well for the attackers, some very bloodied Nazkai. Isengard Ballista crew, again trying to play that game of cat and mouse with the crossbows. There goes the Rohirrim general. Beastmen of Dunland ripping him apart. Again, kiting with crossbows. It's, of course, this is the sort of situation where I do hope the defenders can make something happen, because it's all a little bit unfortunate when it comes down to this sort of thing, but the attackers need to do it, because if they do just throw caution to the wind in melee, there's every chance that the elves could win out, and of course if they had some skirmishes of their own, it could be a different matter. I'm going to keep chasing them though, and why not? As long as they keep them running, they won't be able to use their units. Again, I don't really know what these shield maidens are doing. I don't know what they were thinking going way back over here. They need to be marching in step with the elves. Now is not the time for some strange disunity like this. More communication needed. Especially seeing as the Kindred of Celeborn are doing a very good job at facing off against the hordes of fodder that the... I say hordes. Mob of fodder that the attackers still have. Again with a bit of shield maiden support. Just a few volleys and then their help in melee as well. That could be the way. Kindred of Celeborn as well. In melee terms, the fact that they're dual wielders means that if it does come down to sheer melee, that extra melee defense they get from that is big. Morale is always a potential problem as well. Shield Maiden's actually the ones going to move over here, which is interesting. They're going to try and hold off against any sort of Ravenborn attack. They need to make up their mind what they're doing with those Shield Maidens pretty quickly. I don't really understand what they're trying to accomplish here. Also, unified approaches. The Galathrim nobles surely should be giving the Kindred of Celeborn a helping hand. Although maybe they're not needed. The attacker's starting to sweat a little bit here. Do they have the ability to actually beat these Elven elites in melee? If there were two units you wouldn't want still alive in the late game, it would be the Kindred of Celeborn and the Galathrim warriors. And now they're going to pull back as well, not allowing the crossbow firing squads to have it all their own way. They will set up a nice defensive position. And I mean, they're going after the mounted Ravenborn Wardens. They did some damage to them as well. Out of ammunition perhaps to Shield Maidens. Swords drawn. Kindred of Celeborn took some damage on the approach. I mean, this is where the onus does switch a little bit. I mean, it's on the attackers to move forward. What do they do? Do they play an infinite game of cat and mouse? I hope not. They will want to though, because again, the Ravenborn Wardens, as we've already mentioned, are strong, good unit in melee, but ultimately quite defensive with their spears and not on the same level damage dealing wise as the elves. are the numbers enough? I mean, I'm certainly rooting for the defenders here because I don't want crossbow kiting to be the source of a victory. Still one Galathrun rider left as well. Shield Maidens regrouping with their allies. That Elven rider charging in, doing a good amount of damage to the ballista crew as well. Just look at the trampling he just accomplished there, causing the ballista crew to waver as well. They've caused a lot of misery to the defenders in this battle so far. Shield Maidens will be trying to hunt them down. Bolts being deployed. I think they're trying to go after the Shield Maidens because it's one of the few units they're actually going to be able to face off against. Meanwhile, this is going to be it. For all the marbles, Galathrun nobles getting in and amongst the crossbows now. And the crossbows having to flee in the face of this as well. I mean, the Ravenborn, if the unit gets stretched, the Ravenborn can certainly look after themselves in melee, which is the main point of difference between them and the Uruk-hai crossbows. Kindred of Celeborn. And part of the problem here is going to be morale. Morale for the elves is going to be absolutely fine, especially if their general stays intact. But stuff like this Dunish warband stands a very good chance of routing, and at this point that amount of warband is not the sort of loss that the attackers can really sustain. Taking hits. Uruk-hai raiders and crossbows arriving from the other side now. Another attacking general. That's from the arriving units as well. I mean, the Elven general died for that, but units routing, broken and fighting to the death. The Kindred of Celeborn can't afford to take their foot off the gas now. They need to try and be aggressive and close down as many of these crossbows as is humanly possible. Again, usually I'm fairly impartial and I don't really mind too much who goes on to win a fight like this, but I really hope the defenders can pull this out. Shield Maidens of Rohan now continuing to get into melee, but shaken. They need to keep their nerve here. Last thing the defenders need is units routing off. There's still enough of them that they should be able to keep things together for the moment. What are those Kindred of Celeborn doing? Regrouping with their brethren. Danish warband still broken and fighting to the death. I mean, this does mean that effectively, the Shield Maidens have broken. Forcing those Uruk-hai crossbows to flee. Kindred of Celeborn, only 20 remain. No, don't flee. Don't get into melee quickly, Galathrun nobles. If you flee because of the crossbows, all you're doing is prolonging your demise. Galathrun nobles. I hope that bloody ice cream truck jingle is not being picked up on the microphone too clearly. Especially not at this moment in time. I think it might just be a little bit too much for the defenders. They've been pulled a little bit too wide. Ravenborn Wardens, Kindred of Celeborn, 19 of them, just engaging the Ravenborn Wardens for the moment. Going over here, still some of those Uruk-hai crossbowmen up on the high ground. Still a few mounted Ravenborn Wardens as well. I mean, at this point, trying to burrow your way through the enemy probably isn't the play from the Galathrun nobles. They need to just try and do the damage, but again, getting caught on the Uruk-hai infantry, the most defensively gifted unit that remains for the attackers. Many of the attacking forces shaken though. Morale could yet play its part. Can they do it? Still some of these Kindred of Celeborn doing their thing against the Ravenborn. Trying to force their way through, but I mean... victory still seems certain for them. They have managed to get in and amongst those crossbows to a certain extent, but they need a rout to happen here. Some of them are routing, but fighting to the death means that they're just going to get in the way. It's one of those situations where the fact they're fighting to the death does actually make a big difference. Those Kindred of Celeborn as well, maybe a little bit of a mistake to try and send them this way as well. They tried to peel themselves off the Ravenborn Wardens, and as a result, of course, this will free up the Ravenborn to start shooting as well. So close and yet so far, I think, is going to be the situation here. If they'd made some slightly different calls here late on, the defenders, I think they could have won, but just a little bit too slow. Some of the thinking wasn't quite joined up, I don't think, towards the end, which again, it's not really sweeping mistakes, so to speak, but these are the standards when it comes to a 3v5. If you're going to win, it's going to have to be perfect, like I said, and it has been far from perfect, really, from the defenders. They've done a damn good job, but 26 Galathrim Nobles I don't think is going to be enough in the end. And, I mean, it looked like it was going to be a more significant margin of victory for the attackers than this ended up being. They have had to fall back on the might of their crossbows to get the job done. But that is ultimately the situation. And this is also the moral of the story. Like, crossbows are very effective in Medieval 2, and we've seen that in this battle in spades. 19 remain. 1% the difference. All that the attackers still have left is on screen. A few Uruk-hai. A couple of the mounted version as well, but for the most part it is those Ravenborn Wardens that remain standing. And that is going to be that. A very entertaining battle indeed. And there they go, routing off. And that, I think, should be the end, should it not? There's nothing else that remains for the defenders. They simply want to finish them all off. But yeah, it's a chaotic scene. The battle which used pretty much every part of the settlement, other than maybe that side of the top layer, but even so, if you take the layer as a whole, that is where the battle ended. It's a big settlement as well, so for every part of it to be used in the defence, I don't think this map could have been utilised in any more perfect a manner. So close as well for the defenders. Shame they couldn't get it done. But in the end, like I said, few decisions late on, and indeed like throughout the battle as well. Like they did some good things, I think. Like there was definitely some more restraint shown by some of their ranged units, which was good. It meant they had more later on, although right at the very end they still ran their supply dry. Yeah, and ultimately I think one really key aspect is the fact that Trebuchet clearly wasn't the same sort of force that the Isengard Ballista was, and when the attackers in a 3v5 have an artillery edge, it's going to be difficult for you. So yeah, that was also quite key, and also the attackers knew when to be significantly more aggressive. I mean, they were cutting it fine, of course. All of their infantry, really, dedicated infantry, was killed by the end of it, and they did have to fall back on their crossbows and that ranged punch that they did still have. But for the most part, they knew when to be aggressive, and they started to make their way through those various defensive lines without too much going wrong. Of course, they did have to reset a few times, but you do have the ability to do that when you have this level of numbers advantage. Huge amount of kills for the elves in particular, like 6,000. Not too surprising given the ranged dominance that they do have, and similar amounts of kills for Rohan and Gondor. What got the kills for Rohan, Escalation, both at range and in melee. Helm Hammers, 79 is fairly disappointing. When we first saw the engagement they were in, it looked pretty good, but that was really what lit the touch paper for the attackers to be very aggressive, and as a result the Helm Hammers were a little bit disappointing. Westmark Spearmen proving their resilience as Rohan's best defensive bulwark as well. Various levels of kills, but all of them perfectly acceptable. Different levels of performance for the Westmark Marshals. 214, 155 is good. Again, it depends on the kind of engagement they were in, I think. And then the Shield Maidens, again, various levels of how well they performed, but as long as you get over 100 at least, you're kind of breaking even, and that's what the Shield Maidens were able to do. Helmingast very good as well. I mean, obviously most of those will have come at range, but the fact that they can double as makeshift line infantry and melee will certainly have helped top those kills up to the point where all of them broke 300 kills, which is not bad considering the level of damage they do. More of a defensive archer unit, of course, more multifaceted, similar to the Gondorian ones in comparison to the damage dealing that the elves were certainly doing. So yeah, big thank you to Tommy for making this map and for sharing it. A very enjoyable battle it was indeed. Big thank you to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. As for what's going to be coming up soon, there is another siege battle on this version of Reforged, which is going to be coming up probably in the next weekend slot. Ongoing in midweek will be the tournament battles and the occasional Last Alliance replay as well. I'll see if I can get a siege done in Last Alliance at some point as well, just to give a more complete look about what's going on there. I don't know what level of progress they've made on siege maps in that one, of course. It would be a little bit weird if it was sort of one of your standard Shogun 2 defensive sieges. But also, in the next couple of weeks or so, I'm going to be doing another channel update because things have shifted a little bit, shifted for the better as well, in terms of what I can do with the channel, and I'll be detailing what has happened and how, and the various ways in which it could positively impact the channel depending on what I decide to do going into the second part of the year. But yeah, keep an eye out for that, because if you do want to know what the general route for the channel is going to be going into the second part of the year, that is going to be well worth watching. But it's going to be a good channel update as opposed to the fairly sort of downcast and sort of the most recent channel updates have been more along the lines of not really knowing what was going to be going on, whereas now I have a much better idea of actually what that's going to be, and hopefully that can be to everything's benefits, and we can start to ramp things back up again on the channel, is the general idea that I have at the moment. But enough waffling from me. Big thank you to Tommy once again. Big thanks to all the players who were part of the battle replay. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.